Hi, my name is Travis. I am one of the co-founders and CISO at Workstreet. We're a professional services firm that supports companies in building and operationalizing security and compliance programs. In this video, we're going to be talking about CMMC gap assessments. Gap assessments are pretty simple in that they are exactly what they sound like. When you're working towards CMMC, depending on the level, there's a certain number of controls or essentially things that you need to comply with or do. A gap assessment is looking at that set of controls. Let's say for level 2, that's 110 controls, and they're looking at what you as a company have in place from both a policy and procedure perspective, risk management perspective, and security implementation perspective to understand which of those controls you're complying with or you're meeting. And then whatever you're not meeting essentially are the gaps. And so quite simply, it's what are the gaps or the things that you are not doing for controls that you need to meet for the level of CMMC that you need to achieve. A gap assessment is almost always going to be the first thing that a company should do. And it's almost always going to be the first thing that an assessor or an RPO like Workstreet is going to recommend to you. What I will say is there are cases where companies are at zero. They haven't developed any policies, security or compliance policies and procedures. They really haven't done anything yet to comply with CMMC. In those cases, it might be worth putting some basic foundational pieces like policies and procedures in place before going forward with the gap assessment. Because if you start with the gap assessment when you're at just zero, it's probably just going to show that you're essentially a 0 to the 110 controls for a level 2. So there are some cases where it makes sense to put certain pieces in place before doing the gap assessment. But by and large, the gap assessment should be either the first thing that you do or one of the earliest things you do before you build out a project plan and start remediating to meet the controls that you need to meet for CMMC. When it comes to doing a gap assessment, companies can certainly do those internally using resources that they have. That could be somebody that's running their compliance program. It could be somebody that falls under a security bucket. I do think that having an external eye or an external company, whether that's an assessor or a company that helps with readiness, a company like Workstreet, I think will give you probably a more accurate and honest picture of what your gaps actually are. Because coming from the outside, you're applying a different lens than somebody coming from the inside, somebody who's built out probably some of these policies and procedures or implemented some of these security controls. And so I think an external party is going to give you probably a more valuable and probably more accurate gap assessment. I think the biggest mistake I see companies make in doing gap assessments is conflating a gap assessment with a mock audit. A gap assessment should really be a part of the remediation process. So it should be a part of how you think about building out and managing your compliance program for CMMC, whereas a mock audit is really geared more towards, are you ready to enter the actual audit period? Less of a gap assessment, which I think is something that you use to essentially build out your plan to remediate and get ready for your audit, whereas a mock audit is really kind of like a gate to enter an audit. Once you've done a gap assessment, you should have a pretty clear picture of what are the controls that you're not meeting. From that, you can essentially build a project plan. Each of those controls may translate to multiple tasks or things that you need to do, but it gives you a clear picture and really a structure to build out your CMMC program because you can see exactly what you're missing, whether that gap exists, in a policy or that gap exists in some sort of security configuration on your endpoints or your cloud environment or whatever it might be. And so you can use that to essentially take that same gap assessment, which oftentimes are done or presented in spreadsheets, and almost just change it quite simply into a spreadsheet that you use as a project plan.